However you are and whenever you are, welcome, good souls, to Paranormal Now. I'm Alan B. Smith. Join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal portals and tantalizing turnoffs. Tonight, we are going in a slightly different direction as far as time goes. We're going to do 1 hour tonight with a very special guest and friend in one of the best researchers and minds in the field of ufology, and that's Peter Robbins here tonight. He was also featured in Half Light, which many of you have seen. If you haven't seen the documentary Half Light, please check it out. It's here on the Paranormal Pop channel, and in time, it will be available on other platforms. But for now, this is the only place you can check it out. So please do, if you like it, please like, comment down below, share, and of course, if you enjoy Paranormal Now, Coffee and UFOs, and any content we bring to this channel, please subscribe. I really, really appreciate that. I just wanted to bring this up before we get started. This is an interesting article. It's called, it's entitled, "Could Homeless Aliens Migrate to Rogue Planets?" I thought this is really interesting because we may have to take a note from these aliens. So this is from Earth Sky, and it says, quote, "We haven't found alien civilizations assuming they exist. Why haven't we found alien civilizations assuming they exist?" Irina K. Romanovskaya, a professor of physics and astronomy at Houston Community College System, thinks maybe we've been looking in all the wrong places. In a press release from Cambridge University Press dated May 26, 2022, Romanovskaya said we might be more successful if we considered rogue planets and possible migrating civilizations. More successful, she means, in detecting them. Suppose an alien society's home planet becomes uninhabitable. Then Romanovskaya said aliens might hitch a ride on free-floating planets. And then, of course, I thought to myself, well, okay, if they do that, if they have the technology to jump off of their planet into a passerby, how do you survive? And I guess the assumption there is if you're at that level of technology to be able to leapfrog, then she thinks that they would use nuclear fusion. And perhaps some of these rogue planets and large asteroids would have, access to water and other minerals. And you would have to basically create a rogue biosphere just cruising through the universe. That's pretty amazing. So I had to share that with you all, and I'll put the link in the comment section right now as we speak. I'd love to hear your comments on this as well. If you jump off one planet onto a free floating planet, free of the gravity of a star, and you're just in the blackness of space, I'm not sure I'd be willing to do that. All right. So as always, if you are a fan of coffee as much as I am, please go to aliencoffeebean.com and enter the promotion code for 20% off, mystery20. That's mystery20, all caps, for 20% off. However, shipping is only available in the United States. It's aliencoffeebean.com. And now we are going to bring on one of our favorites, one of the longtime recurring guests on Paranormal Now. He's one of my earliest guests on Paranormal Now, and I really appreciate that he did so and honored me with coming onto the show when I was just a little fledgling podcast that few were aware of. Peter Robbins, welcome.
Thanks, Alan. Good to be back.
Thank you. It's so happy to have you back. And you're also back in the States as well.
I am.
Yeah. It looks like it's going to be a busy season for the ufology community with events and conferences. Are you feeling excited to get back to it?
Yeah. Like almost everybody else on the planet for 2 years plus, I was fairly sedentary, and a major adventure might have been going to the market or going out of my house.
Right.
And in April, I ventured out a little further to Edinburgh, Texas, for their wonderful UFO festival and conference. And up until a few days ago, I was out of the country all month, the first half back in England for the first time in some years, and the second half in Bahamas. and that's why I look slightly healthier than usual.
Yeah, and you've got the lighter shirt, which really accentuates the look. It's brilliant.
That is
So,
my fashion consultants.
yeah, I know we've talked too, especially during the pandemic or before the pandemic, about how much we love New York City, and you know have a deep, deep love for NYC, but you don't live there anymore.
I
During the
can't afford
pandemic,
it.
well, and during the pandemic, we left the city, and for us, what we appreciated about visiting upstate New York is the open space, right? And during the pandemic, we felt like we really need for our minds to not feel trapped. Do you feel at least a little bit more thankful in some degree where you live now, um, seeing the pandemic play out?
No question about it. And as much as I love my hometown and always will, I will always consider it my home. Whether or not I'll ever be able to live there again is very iffy, but
Mm,
I do feel very fortunate to be where I am. You know this part of the state and have visited here. It's a beautiful area, and Lord knows during the pandemic, Manhattan and the boroughs were
yeah,
often not the most pleasant or easiest place to be home based.
right. So, where are we now, Peter? With your interest in the UFO phenomena, are you more interested in cases, or are you more interested in the experience?
Yeah, good question. Definitely more interested in being a support for experiencers and abductees, but that's how I started in this work more than 40 years ago.
Mhm.
I certainly have done my share of casework, and I think I discussed it briefly in your wonderful documentary Half Light that over the years, who doesn't want to know more about these other intelligences? And I refer here, in the world of UFOs, there are so many possible explanations that are viable and worthy of our respect. Um, the kind of Keel Valet aspects of the work of interdimensional and
Mhm.
non-corporeal, the more traditional, I'll say, of extraterrestrial and advanced technology and beings doing what they're doing. In that focused area that most of my professional life has been around, namely what so many people, interestingly for me now, think of more as a footnote or an improbable or just kind of conservative of extraterrestriality, which I find really kind of amusing
Yeah.
because, of course, we're not alone in the universe. Um, but I think I will always have questions and interests in who are they? And there are a myriad of theys. Why are they here? Where do they come from? What is their home situation like? What
Mhm.
powers their technology? But more and more, I realize my primary interest is the impact that they and this subject have on us, human beings, and the potential of bringing us together. And boy, we sure need bringing together in so many respects.
Mhm.
This is certainly the most dissonant time, certainly in this young country's history in 170 years or so, uh, in terms of fractured uh, alliances and partisan, fighting.
Mhm.
That taking this subject seriously has the byproduct of making us realize how much more we have in common with each other
Yeah.
than separates us. And so I think that will be more and more my focus as I move on in my work.
Do you think that the UAP UFO study is immune to politicization?
To a degree, um, I think the ufological research community and the experiencer abductee community are probably completely representative of, political thinking in this country and divergent views as anybody not involved in this work.
Hmm.
And yet, most of us, um, we will agree to disagree on domestic and political issues, to a degree, cultural issues, but we are united in this work to whatever degree, we come to it and what our own priorities are. And I think if we can do it, there's hope for others. Um, it's not always easy going, but one can say the same about, folks, again, who are not involved in this field and have their own circles of interest, and I'm sure find conflict or, agreement among their colleagues and people that they work with in their areas of study.
Yeah. Can we expect a book from Peter Robbins anytime soon?
Yeah, probably end of this year, certainly next year. I am
That's
at
fantastic.
work on a book, and several kind of in the chute behind that. And it's been a fairly long break
Hmm.
after the scandal some years ago that erupted around the originally very highly praised a bestseller in the UK, on the Rendlesham Forest incident, which was certainly understandable and deserved for reasons we don't even have to go into here. It really knocked me out of the box for a while and created just a lot of depression and writer's block. And it took me a while to work my way out. But yeah, I'm definitely at work on another book right now, with a colleague who I am very pleased to be working with, very different in every possible respect than my last co-author, and will hold the subject of the book for a later time.
Yeah.
But it does
So,
have to do with
uh,
UFOs, to be
are,
sure.
I was going to ask, right? So, does it focus on the more events side of things, or leaning towards the experience itself?
As I said, we'll leave that for when we're closer to the mark.
God, I tried.
Good
All
work.
right. So, well, you know what? For me, I tend to be leaning into my interest tends to be leaning more into the experiencer aspect of all this. And in a way, I think it's because there is more of a mainstreaming, a little bit more of an acceptance of the study of ufology, and we're starting to see funding go into legitimate programs like the Galileo Project and others. And so I'm kind of hoping that the nuts and bolts ufologists and the new scientists, will keep working that field and do a better job than we ever have, right? Um, and I can drift into the more speculative aspects and the consciousness aspect, because I think consciousness is a field of study for everyone, for every individual.
Well, not only is that the case, but that is now the case in overdrive. And in that sense, we live in a much healthier climate for open discussion of the wider issues here and their implications. Uh, as anybody even remotely observing this field for the past 75 years knows, it has been informed by extraordinary ridicule, so much so that that has become another priority of mine over the last years. And I'll be giving a paper next month at the annual International MUFON UFO Symposium, the first time I've spoken for that group at that level in about half a dozen years, on the origin of UFO ridicule. It's
Mhm.
something that I think has interested all of us at one time or another, but
Right.
that I really become quite deeply involved in the last years because it's so counterintuitive. It makes no sense whatsoever. How did it happen
Mhm.
that somebody saying, I saw something in the sky that I had never seen before and I couldn't identify, get hardwired up with you're delusional, you're a
Yeah.
hoaxer, you're mentally ill, you're a mystic, you want to be famous, you're lonely, one of my favorites, or take your pick. It makes
Mhm.
no effing sense whatsoever. And yet that has run the game up until about 5 years ago when things started to change. And now that change is reflected in, well, I'm sure you have similar experiences that I have, that people that you've known in your life for years that have no real interest in this, except
Mhm.
maybe through you casually, are now more curious about it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm back and forth with people that I know going back to the first grade, and elementary school and high school and university and other areas of my professional life over the years, who are now interested, and maybe more important, um, are openly willing to express that interest because the ridicule is so diminished. We're seeing it big time
Yeah.
in politics and the media. I think it's fascinating and very healthy that in terms of American politics, that the left and the right seem to have no differences of opinion at the most verbal levels when it comes to this subject. You look at somebody emblematic of a right-wing Republican like Marco Rubio of Florida, and
Mhm.
somebody seen as, I think, a bright progressive like our state senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who
Mhm.
are both very forthright about their interest in the subject, and Gillibrand particularly
Yep.
pushing very hard with her brilliant 140-page proposal on permanent study committees. And then in the media, it doesn't matter whether it's Fox or CNBC,
Mhm.
they're taking it seriously. This is good. This can't be bad. This is something that will continue to open it up and
Mhm.
make it more and more an insider rather than an outsider subject.
Yeah, I guess the way I take away from what you said is almost like the cat's out of the box and you can't get it back in. Is that where we're at?
Correct.
Okay. Uh, the hearings that we had recently, were you encouraged by what you saw?
Symbolically, yes. The content of the hearings was, for those of us who are steeped in the study of this, kind of a joke. It was not even UFO 101. It was
Right.
coy with a hammer, as far as I was concerned.
Mhm.
There's a great deal of posing, in a sense, for me, going on within the community of secret keepers, who, what we were given in terms of the report was a redacted version of a report that probably wasn't filled with secrets, somewhat redacted.
Mhm.
And it was very clear that there was no interest, no possibility, even as far as I'm concerned, of discussing the more problematic, the more actual realities that accompany the basic given that we're not alone. And that includes crashes and retrievals, abduction,
Mhm.
missing pregnancies, hybrids. You think this is going to come out of a study committee, or that this is going to be released, by, again, the secret keepers for the general public to consider? Not likely. I think that they would rather, you know, do anything than touch this material. What's happening is good, but we're a light year away from where we're going to need to be at a certain point.
Yeah.
And this may drag on for years and years, with
Mhm.
several reports a year coming, each one staged to seem a little more open. But really, I think stage being the operative idea here. At the
Mhm.
same time, it will draw more and more attention, and I would like to think interest of the general public and of people who are involved in the work, are articulate, have some media outlets to continue to criticize, to suggest, to point out, to fill in the blanks as they're able.
Mhm.
But, it's such an overwhelming series of realities that, when people call for disclosure, as more and more people are doing, I think we have to think through what that actually means. Years ago, it started to occur to me that you coming from my original, thoughts 40 odd years ago, a power to the people. We want the truth. We can handle it. Give it to us now. That's a bit of a fantasy, because a
Naive.
lot of people, and the great majority of the public, I think, are not really ready for all this stuff. There are so many decent folks out there who maybe now are starting to pay attention to, gee, maybe there is something to this UFO subject, who the last thing they are prepared for right now is learning about hybrids that are part us, part them, about
Mhm.
crashes and retrievals, about this litany of aspects of this subject that are kind of rough,
Yeah.
and you can't dig half a hole. Um, I think disclosure itself has to be thought through, and even by those of us calling for it, there has to be a way to manage the release of information in a way that doesn't overwhelm the public at
Mhm.
large. I don't know the answer to this, but it does concern me.
Yeah, I'm on board with all that. The one thing I was thinking about though is perhaps it's an early tease, is that there's now protocol to find out what the pilots felt, what they experienced emotionally, or if they felt any physical sensations. So the fact that they're at least taking that physiological um, experience into consideration, that's maybe a baby step, but it might be an early step in the direction of going beyond just weapons systems.
I think it's very important, and I think you've hit on a very singular aspect of it here. People can relate to the experiences and feelings of other people, and given the nature of the way that we're brought up, the culture we live in, the way that we tend
Mhm.
to see humanity, uh, for many people, if you are a trained observer, if you are a respected member of the military or law enforcement, the weight of your statement counts a little bit more. Then there are
Sure.
other people who feel just the opposite. You can't trust anybody who has anything to do with the establishment or control
Yeah.
or defense. I think what we're also seeing within the wider community of experiencers, abductees, researchers, investigators is one group saying they're here, they're good. If they wanted to, dominate us, we'd be dominated. More and more people are reporting positive, life affirming, transcendent experiences. We need to, kind of in the Star Trek terms, grow to join the Federation and welcome the Space Brothers. And
Mhm.
then at the same time saying anybody who has background in government can't be trusted. Um, Anybody with a background in the military, is only thinking defensively and how to develop weapon systems to kill them off because of fear of the unknown. And
Mhm.
other folks who are saying, deception informs a great deal of them. Their behavior has been monitored over the decades, and that perhaps what they are doing better right now is running their program in a way that more and more people are buying it, that they're making corrections or smoothing things out so
Mhm.
that they do lull in more and more. And I have a dark sense of humor. I can't help it. It gets me by. But remembering that wonderful classic Twilight Zone episode, To Serve Man, which
Yes.
ends with the knowledge it's a cookbook. Not
Right.
that, not that that's the way it is, but
Right.
we don't really know the way it is. The
Right.
mantra of the X-Files poster jumps into mind. I want to believe. We all want to believe something about this. We all want them to be good, to help us out of the predicaments that we're in. And boy, do we need help. But I don't think that's going to happen. We still need to deal with our own mess here on Earth, and it's becoming questionable whether or not we will be able to. Um, what their motivations are. And again, there are so many theys potentially
Mhm. Yeah.
that I get concerned when I hear people speak in absolutes in our field. This is
Yes.
the way it is, as opposed to this is what my opinion is. This is what my beliefs are. This is
Mhm.
what my particular research has led me to conclude, as opposed to this is. People who say this is in the work are people who I generally back away from and approach when I do with caution in terms of the ideas that they're putting out there. Cultism is not unknown in the world of UFO studies.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's two kinds of people that fall into that is category, and that's people who are a little bit more either cultish, slash they just want to believe it so much they tell themselves it's true and speak in such terms, or the other group, which might be someone who has nefarious, end game, and whether that's for personal gain or some other political game or whatever, there's the my alarm bells go off, and I said, can I trust this person?
Yep. Um, I'm not interested in naming names, but there are certainly a number of personalities in the work whose egos and whose grand plans really revolve around a certain amount of believe me, follow
Mhm.
me. I know
Right.
the answers. I wish
Yeah.
I could tell you how I know them, but I'd be compromising my sources or putting you in danger or blah, blah, blah. When what they should be saying is, this is what I personally believe. Or maybe more honestly, this is what I want to be true. And if you want it to be true too, then let's have it be our mutual longing and have us
Mhm.
want to have it be true together, which makes that kind of self engaged system really no different than a religion. It's
Yeah.
faith based in belief, reinforced by the numbers of individuals that share that belief, each one drawing strength from the fact that, well, there are hundreds or thousands or millions or billions of us that feel this way, so surely it must be this way. Not necessarily.
Yeah. Well, we talk about that in the documentary Half Light. F- where's that line? So one can draw from these, almost religious, ecstasy like experiences, and have a spiritual revelation or growth from that. And that seems to be a positive. But then when does it go wrong? Is there a place where we go too far?
It varies from instance to instance. I
Mhm.
think if you're a fairly emotionally healthy person, and none of us are infallible as far as character judgments go, to trust your common sense, your intuition, um, your sense of critical thinking,
Mhm.
deductive reasoning, and make the final decisions for yourself. And where possible, do the research for yourself. Again, my primary concerns are not so much, I leave that to other colleagues about all the aspects of them,
Mhm.
but about those of us here on Earth and
Yeah.
how we're doing about this, and to find ways to lend support to individuals who need it, want it, or really require it. Um, I'm a humanist, and I look at this not so much as some visionary, mystical belief system, but person by person. And that was something that was instilled in me from the start. In that, my sister Helen, who comes up in Half Light, talked to me many years ago about her fragmented but very clear, always conscious memories of one of her abduction experiences. That when
Mhm.
she first talked to me about it, I had never heard anything like it in my life.
Yeah.
And now, of course, I've heard such similar accounts more times than I can remember. And the years that I spent working as assistant to Bud Hopkins brought me into very close contact, certainly with several hundred extremely credible people from every walk of life and background who had had variations of experiencer and abduction memories, realities, and in many cases backed up by physical, hard evidence, multiply witnessed accounts, physiological changes to organic material, um, implants, scars that appear overnight, and the like, that if such things could be judged in a court of law, would
Hmm.
certainly warrant a grand jury being seated to study what was being presented.
Sure. When you, Bud, and you were looking into these experiencers, um, how do you know when someone is being truthful? I'm assuming on occasion there must have been someone who you felt wasn't being honest with you about this ET contact experience. How did you discover that?
Those cases, I would say, in retrospect, were a great deal rarer than many people would imagine. Then again, I believed somebody for years whose account was exaggerated, confabulated, partially lies, and bought it. Partly because I had never had an experience of anybody whose intention was to fool me at that level of the game, certainly. But it's never one thing. Um, Bud would spend time with the families of these individuals in many cases, and I would occasionally as well. Um, you're sitting with three generations in one family, and they've had the same experiences. They have nothing to prove. They're not interested in making money. They're certainly not interested in becoming public figures on it. They just want some answers to familial situations. Again, within that group of people, if medical situations have warranted, anomalous objects have turned up in their body in CAT scans or X-rays, some of which were removed, and some by the late great Dr. Roger Lear, a
Mhm.
podiatric surgeon who made it his business
Yeah.
to remove and have analyzed these various implants, often with surprising results, um, even to a point that he answered a huge question for me, which was how could an object no bigger than a BB or a grain of rice be placed in somebody's body repeatedly in terms of the mass of individuals that have reported these things subcutaneously or deep into, tissue, never ever showing any scarification. And more intriguing to me, and I don't have a scientific background, but we certainly learn what we need to do the work that we do. If you get a splinter, the white blood cells go crazy. They rush to that area and want to know what the hell's going on. And if there's a situation they need to fight, you see the redness around the splinter.
Hmm.
Were these things not recognized by the body?
Right.
And what Lear established was they had micron thin, super tough stealth type coatings, very much analogous to the aircraft that
Wow.
registers such a small signature on radar and were really quite miraculous when we first started to hear about them, but
Hmm.
that the body doesn't recognize them as such. And the other thing is the neighbors or people or friends who were caught up in these situations as well, or
Sure.
that time when the electricity went out in the neighborhood and there were 100 reports of lights in the night sky, and then the
Hmm.
burn mark in the backyard, then the family pet dying of a rare form of cancer within weeks. None of these on their own are statistically important, but when they all start to add up, also at a certain point, character, credibility,
Hmm.
um, the person's own history of integrity.
Yeah.
At a certain point, you say yes or no.
Right. I mean, Debbie Jordan Cauble, neighbors in her community saw a craft, lights. I mean, like I've said to her before, like that must feel so good because so many other experiencers don't have that corroboration. But when that happens, it's a matter of probability. It's like, how can all these things be happening at the same time and nothing is true?
Yeah.
It,
And
it,
Deb, for anybody who is not familiar with her case, Deb White Cabell, who is a dear friend and who is the subject of a very important case study published as the book Intruders by Bud Hopkins, which was an international bestseller, is one of the very best case histories, if you want to introduce yourself to this subject, that you can find. I mean, everything from when the electricity goes out in the neighborhood to that burn mark with the skid mark where that craft came in the yard, and the
yeah,
fact that nothing grew on that spot for a year and a half, the fact that her mother had the same scar on her leg that Deb had on the same leg, and on down the details of the cases that happened, um, in particular scientific method. Um, and she's still very much out there as a presence in the work.
yeah.
She has a wonderful memoir out right now. And there are so many people like her who are not public, who I'd like to think are reinforced or know that they're not alone by people like Deb White Cabell and others who have had the courage to come forward and allow their cases to be documented, and in many cases, extremely well documented.
Peter, we have a question from YouTube. Ufi asks, Peter, do you think your interest in the paranormal slash UFO phenomena will ever wane?
Um, I don't think so, but at the same time, I came into this field of study with a number of other very active interests. Um, the world of the visual arts, um, film and filmmaking, photography, travel, psychology, um, that I will always have those interests as well. Also, for many of us, when you first come into this work, however you do it, it's sort of like crashing through a door. Um, and for me, I was obsessed with certain aspects of this on and on for years. I would not characterize myself as obsessed now, and not for years, but my interest in it is just that, a genuine interest, which I know that I will never have all of my questions answered. And I remember years ago thinking, when one of my first mentors died, well, he didn't get the answers, and you may not either. How do you feel about that? And upon reflection, I realized, how boring would life be without mysteries?
Mm.
Um, I can't even imagine. I think it's one of the things that fascinates all of us in one way or another.
Yeah.
Um, Whether you like a good detective novel, or you take the subject of the afterlife seriously, or lights in the night sky and the possibility of life in the cosmos, or an interdimensional reality, or
Mm.
lost civilizations, whatever it is.
Yeah.
There's no chance that I will ever not be interested in things, and I'm sure that will go with me to the grave.
Yeah. Well, you made me think about cats. I was imagining cats without curiosity. What would that look like? I don't know if it would be a very exciting life.
Well, for what
Yeah.
it's worth, cats are my favorite animal. I can't imagine not being around them. And
Hmm.
in the Bahamas for the past few weeks, um, I was there partly on a retreat, partly to spend time with my oldest best friend and his family, but also to document horrific storm damage that had not been repaired or really addressed from the 2019 Hurricane Dora, that
Mm.
became a Category 5 hurricane and stalled over the island of Abaco, where his family had had a home for years, generating winds of up to 185 miles per hour. And we've all seen carnage, whether it's natural or man-made, in the media, from the time we can remember. But I had never seen damage like this close up. And
Yeah.
so it was several weeks of documenting it. The reason I bring it up is because I love cats. They just fascinate me. I enjoy being around them. And
Hmm.
it wasn't until my very last day when we were visiting friends who lived out in a really remote part of the island on a beautiful spit of land facing the ocean that two of the neighbor cats wandered in. And it was just, I was like a 7-year-old. It was whoopee, cats, and had a great afternoon in part because I had cats to play with.
That's the magic of cats.
I'm a cheap date.
It really, yeah. It's like, I remember not too long ago, I was with some people and got my hands on a soccer ball, and I just started kicking it around, and someone was like, you look like a child, right? Like, I was just so joyous to have a soccer ball, and kicking it on my knees, and I'm playing with by myself, and I was just happy. Sometimes it's those simple things, that give us joy, and
Exactly.
and that's the thing, is that we might get the answer to the big questions one day for extraterrestrials, um, but my happiness can't rely on that.
No,
Yeah.
no. And the fact is, we are here on Earth, whatever else is going on above us, below us, or around us in this dimension and related dimensions. Um, and we should be actively pursuing interesting, contributing lives, leaving the world around us, at least immediately, a little better than we found it. At the same time, if this is the field that we've chosen to be involved in,
Hmm.
doing what we can to be of support or contribute knowledge or information as we're able.
Yeah. I was on a panel recently and another show, and they, without asking me, just labeled me ufologist. And I'm not really comfortable with that term because I cover so much of the paranormal. And I noticed that you tend to steer away from that on occasion. Not that you aren't a ufologist. Is there a reason for that? Or am I misnoticing?
No, no. First, whenever you receive a label, and boy, that term ufologist and ufology have taken a hell of a beating, and in great part warranted the past years. But it doesn't preclude my interest in other areas of
Hmm.
non-standard study. Um, I remember fairly early on when I was starting out and just getting things published or doing early casework, a standard response from somebody over me, oh, you're into UFOs. So are you into ghosts and reincarnation and spirits and, mysteries? And, it was like, screw you. If I say yes, you're going to just label me as some, airhead goofball
Hmm.
who is, lighter than air and not very well grounded. But of course, I have interest in all that stuff, and for quite a long time, I completely ignored any request for the level of my interest in other subjects because I felt in other paranormal subjects because I felt it would be used to demean the work I was trying to do in
Right.
this area that I'm most intrigued by and most involved in. And now I could care less, really.
So again, the exo consciousness aspect of this, I feel like that's kind of where you're leaning towards. And uh, is that literally an extraterrestrial exo consciousness or something else? What do you think? Or are there more things going on here, than we can imagine?
I think that Shakespeare always was the greatest observer of human nature, and there are more things. There are more things. I'm forgetting the exact quote. Than
Ratio.
yeah, um, the universe, the world is not only stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. There
Right.
are more
Mhm.
things uh, than we can grasp, and even if we have vast imaginations and we have a background in hard science or psychology, at a certain point we're just feeling our way around the edges. The parable about the six blind men and the elephant, trying to explain to each other what an elephant is, where one's got his arms wrapped around the legs, the other's holding the trunk, the other's got an ear, the other's patting the side of the elephant, the other's got the tail, the other's holding a tusk, and they're all telling each other that they're wrong because that's not their experience of the elephant.
Yeah.
Hence, welcome to the wonderful world of paranormal studies, and
Right.
believe what you want to believe rather than what may be that you are completely unaware of.
Bro, this is the problem with studying it. Since you don't know what it is exactly, it's hard to find the tools or the means in which to examine. And so, do you have any ideas of what we're missing? What we maybe could be doing to better understand this?
Um, there's a definition of a Zen beginner, which is knowing that you know nothing and having
Mhm.
it be all right. You and I know more than nothing about the UFO subject and the paranormal. But what can we say absolutely, conclusively, and empirically? Not a lot. Um, I think one of the things is never shut your mind off to the views from the views of others.
Mhm.
Even if you feel that you are going to disagree with somebody, listen to what they have to say. Examine the evidence that they're presenting if they have evidence. Um, Never stop the active process of learning. We all have kind of invisible divining rods in us, leading us in certain directions. Follow your bliss, as Joseph Campbell would say. Continue your own explorations. Make notes, keep notebooks, read
Mhm.
books, watch documentaries, challenge even the most established figures if you feel you disagree with them. Um, there are no giants in this work who are so um, rock solid that they can't be questioned nor their views. There are people in the field of UFO studies and paranormal studies that I have tremendous admiration for, living and not,
Mhm.
and others who I don't take seriously at all. Others who I think are somewhat damaging
Yeah.
because I think that they're fairy tales that they have convinced themselves of and do their best to convince others of for reasons best known to themselves.
Mhm.
Again, maybe some kind of ego gratification or sense of power or a false sense of leadership. And I don't think there's any set formula. Again, for me,
Yeah.
even if you had unlimited funding, your own personal laboratory, a staff of well trained individuals in different
Mhm.
areas of study, your best research tools are still going to be critical thinking, um, common sense, deductive reasoning, and following your own gut feelings. You can be wrong, but so can they.
Right. So, do you think that these, you know, figures or leaders in these fields that perhaps are dishonest, do you think that that's slowing or deterring the study?
I think it depends on the leader or the alleged leader. Uh, every case is different.
Mhm.
Every individual is different. Every motivation is motivated by things like an iceberg that we have some sense of above the surface, but
Mhm.
depending on their history, their life, their goals, their passions, their objectives, their challenges, we have no idea really what drives them. Again, all we can do is the best we can do. And just blind belief is never the way to go. Um, if something serves you and makes you feel, warm and fuzzy inside and gives you peace of mind, that's fine. But that shouldn't necessarily be confused with what actually is going on. And again, in the area of study I'm most familiar with, in that subtext area of
Mhm.
UFO studies, around abduction, around people's experiences, around the presence of other intelligences manifested by beings often described as the Greys, which represents a very small part of UFO reality.
Yeah.
There's always seemingly deception involved to some degree, not
Mhm.
unlike human behavior. And when we want to, what do they think? What's going on behind those little collective beehive minds? The best I can do sometimes is say, how would I behave? And that's not very helpful. Um, the great anthropologist Margaret Mead, about 50 years ago or so, um, addressed this subject briefly. And her, as I recall, her reaction was if I came upon, as an anthropologist, somewhere in the center of the unexplored Amazon, in an area where no, call them first world people had ever been, and no aircraft had ever flown over. And I
Right.
peered through the bushes and I looked down into the valley, and there is an untouched, uncorrupted Stone Age tribe living as they have for the past 50,000 years. My
Mhm.
first impulse would be to study them, to set up my recording equipment, to take
Yeah.
notes, to film until we discover oil or gold. And then all bets are off. Um, the other thing is sometimes I'm not a big science fiction person.
Mhm.
People confuse people who are into the study of UFOs with being major science fiction fans. Many
Mhm.
are, and that's wonderful. And there's a lot of great science fiction out there. And I'm fortunate enough to have read quite a bit of it and seen great science fiction films and read
Mhm.
a certain amount of crap and seen wonderfully bad films as well.
Mhm.
But those first 2 years of Star Trek, which are the only ones that really interested me, given my age and predisposition and what I was doing at different times. I know there are a lot of great Star Trek spin-offs that came from that, but the idea of the Prime Directive, uh,
Yeah.
Gene Roddenberry, who was a real character, and I don't agree with him on everything in his personal life, but he was a visionary, like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, in terms of looking into possible futures and just thinking in a very rich and diverse way. And the
Mhm.
idea there was if you are a quote unquote advanced culture and you encounter a culture that is more primitive, never ever, if you have any feelings for that culture, show all your cards.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
display all your technological, hardware and knowledge and,
Mhm.
the whole 9 yards, because it could cause their entire culture to collapse. Um, Carl Jung, who wrote a book in the 1950s, as I recall, called Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies, being Carl Jung, spent part of the book talking about this is a projection of our longing of a new pantheon of secular gods, to help
Mhm.
us and replace the fact that, we're messing things up and our traditional monotheistic God doesn't seem to be as helpful as we'd like him to be. And then
Right.
saying, yeah, and they're probably here too as advanced beings from other places. He wrote at one point about an encounter he had had with a tribal leader. This might have been around the First World War or something. A man who, as a boy in Africa, maybe in the 1880s, remembered that moment when British explorers, military people, came into their village. And none of
Mm.
these people had ever seen a Westerner, let alone a white person dressed in
Mhm.
red, carrying this thunder stick that could, explode the loudest sound imaginable, and a pig 30 yards away would die.
Right.
Um, were these people gods? Were they the ghosts of ancestors? Were they demons?
Mm.
And I think the quote was when Jung asked him the impact on his village and the societal aspect of it, he said, all our dreams died. Everything kind of fell apart. And
Mm.
everything that held us together was now in question in so many words.
Mhm.
Once again, disclosure. how best to manage this in a way, and how can you possibly manage it? I don't know. Again, you
Yeah, yeah.
you can't dig half a hole. So it is a huge challenge that is incumbent on those of us who are involved in
Hmm.
disseminating information and doing our best to educate our fellow human beings as well as we can. I think my strengths are primarily um, perceiving myself as objectively as I can in the work that I've done over the decades of couching my casework in actual post-war 20th century history, citing real events, using real gilt-edged, authentically declassified documentation, and getting people into the foyer, just in through the first door, and having them maybe at the end of a talk that I give say, he doesn't seem crazy. He made a good case for the limited proposal that he's put forward. Maybe there
Hmm.
is something to this, and then turning them over to colleagues who will assist them into the living room and make them run out screaming or
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, right. And I was thinking about these extraterrestrials, and let's just say they did want to make contact on a grand scale. Based on what you were telling me with the analogy with some long forgotten Amazonian tribe, or I don't think that they would have enough employed transitional therapists to deal with that. There's, how many billions of us here now? I can't imagine them thinking, "Oh, we can handle this." Like, even as an advanced species, I don't know.
Well, one can only, guess and make conjecture. If
Mhm,
they, and once again, the ubiquitous they, there may be 180 days, there may be 12, there may be countless days. We have no idea, although some
mhm,
people say that they do. Um, if they wanted to make their presence known to all of us on this planet at one time, they could simply do it. I'd like to think that the reason that they don't or that they haven't is because they realize the potential for chaos, confusion, mass panic, fear, the crash potentially of aspects of our economic systems,
mhm.
challenges to people of faith, um, challenges to secular thinkers. And gosh, if there are these power sources, that can run these craft, through unbelievable, light years, um, perhaps with no pollution per se, and renewable, kind of motor functions, it could throw a panic into the industries that supply our power now. It's one of the arguments that people continue to use, and I get both sides of it, that we need to continue to develop our, petroleum sources here, especially
Mhm.
with the Russian incursion in Ukraine and all of the spin-off horrifics and insanity and economic blowback we're all experiencing from it, at the same time as we're developing solar power, wind power, um, hydrogen based systems, and more theoretical ways of running. The argument for continuing to build nuclear plants on a certain level, I think, is madness. There surely must be something better, but I get the arguments. I absolutely do. Um, the There's a mini series that came out in the 80s that was remade maybe half a dozen years ago, called V, as in victory. Some of your viewers may remember it. Um, it I thought was pretty hokey. And the aliens come to Earth. They all look like models. All the
That's
guys
true.
have
That's
blow
true.
dried hair and look like soap opera stars. All the women, are the equivalent. But of course, under their latex skins, they're eating mice and getting ready to eat us, and not
Mhm.
very pleasant beings. But I thought that it had one of the greatest science fiction premise beginnings of any science fiction. What if they came? that I've ever seen or read, namely, which was one morning, everybody gets up, and over the 60 or 80 biggest cities in the world, 1 mile up is a 1 mile across mothership. Game fucking over. That's
Right.
it.
Yeah.
You
Yep.
know, and the rest of it is history.
Yeah.
Um,
It speaks volumes. If you wake up to that, you know they've got the advantage.
ain't much to argue about after that.
Right.
But
Peter,
they
if
don't do that. They don't do that. And perhaps, again, perhaps for the same reasons that I'd like to think we wouldn't do that, incurring a what we would call primitive, often we find out after the fact, are anything but in terms of their relationships with each other, their belief systems, their relationship with the natural life around them, and being good shepherds of nature. The way that they see the universe and the cosmos, in many cases, is more advanced than so-called Western world.
if a cataclysmic event was destined for Earth, but you had a chance to leapfrog onto a rogue planet and survive and adrift in space, would you do it? Or would you go down with the ship?
Well, is my choice here dying in the fiery inferno of Earth, or not dying in the fiery inferno of Earth?
You would definitely be dying in this
Yeah,
case. Hence
um,
the leapfrogging.
I'm
Yeah.
out there in space.
All right. Yeah. I think I'd do the same thing. I'm curious enough as it is already. So hey, if I don't have a choice, I might as well go.
Seat on the
Uh,
plane? Sure.
right. What about everyone in chat? Would you go down with the ship, or would you go adrift, lost in space? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Lost in Space. That's another series. Did you watch that? Speaking of sci-fi interest, when you were younger.
I'd have to get back to you on that. But this was not a subject that really was very compelling to me when I was a kid. In
Real? Oh.
fact, it hardly crossed my mind at all. Um, I didn't develop an interest in this subject until I was in my late 20s,
Hmm.
except for the wonderful bad and good B movies that I grew up watching on television and at the Fantasy Theater in Rockville Center, New York,
Hmm.
which were just joyously goofy, giant radioactive spiders and beings from space, and them, the giant ants, and the
Yep.
incredible shrinking man, and all these things ignited uh, my imagination. I was a big reader as a kid, and I wasn't into any of that stuff. I like model airplanes, and I collected stamps and coins and bugs. I was a Cub Scout and a Boy Scout. I loved woodcraft. I loved cooking. I still love
Mm.
cooking, and a lot of that other stuff too. But the world of life on other planets, not so much. Didn't really think about it.
We've already gone over a little bit here, Peter. But one last question: what's your favorite go-to music?
That's like asking me my favorite movie. Black
Right.
and white, what era, foreign, domestic.
Hmm.
Um, um, I grew up with very eclectic opportunities, like a lot of people in my generation.
Yeah. Sure.
Um, I grew up with early rock and roll, rhythm and blues,
Hmm.
Motown, um, heavy metal. I through my sister, I became a real devotee of a lot of the early punk bands at CBGB's. But
Hmm.
at 13, I was brought to the Metropolitan Opera for the first time to see Aida in a junior high school class. And I've worked as a supernumerary at the Metropolitan Opera,
Hmm.
even in a production of Aida and about 20 years ago with Pavarotti. I love classical music. I love Gilbert and Sullivan.
Yeah.
Um, I'm a human sponge as far as that goes.
Yeah.
I have so many. Well, it's just another example of a lot of the interests that I
Mhm.
have and stuff that I really enjoy. Um, Broadway show music, especially the golden age of it, I was a big
Mhm.
fan of growing up. Um, so, sorry to give you such a poor answer to that specific question.
All right. Here's a specific question: when you're feeling down, Like, what are your few songs that you feel like you could put in and it'll lift your spirit?
It depends, I guess, on my mood. Sometimes I'll listen to some of my sister's old recordings, which are still pretty kick-ass.
Yeah.
Um, New bands, and for me, new bands can be 20 years old.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, me
Music,
too.
Motown and soul are always go-to for me.
Yeah.
Like a lot of white kids of my generation, my first total immersion in Black culture was through that music. And it was my Russian grandmother who introduced me to jazz. She loved jazz music. And by the age of 7, I knew who Louis Armstrong was, and Ella Fitzgerald, and Count Basie, and
Mhm.
Benny Goodman, and the big band era stuff, which my parents loved. Um, it varies wildly,
Yeah.
and that's fine with me. I can't make generalizations for myself. It's really a whim of the moment.
That's true. Yeah, I think we're probably almost like that. I do hope that there's going to be a jazz renaissance at some point. There's so much jazz out there. Blue jazz, cool jazz, bebop jazz, and you have acid jazz that came up in the late '80s and '90s, and that was kind of a little bit of a uh, um, you know comeback, but then it was limited, and I hope pop culture finds it again.
You
But
know,
for me, jazz is the go-to music. And I can
it's
always
funny
listen to jazz. Yeah.
for me that you mentioned jazz because a good local friend, my friend Soraya, who does a wonderful weekly paranormal show on Saturday nights with maybe the best title of any show I know, which was "Where Did the Road Go?"
I
He
love
also
that.
does a new
Yeah.
music show on the weekends. And
Mhm.
I guess it's now maybe 4 or 5 years ago, he invited Richard Dolan and me, and Richard's an old friend, and we both love jazz, but different types of jazz, to basically be disc jockeys for 2 hours and go
Mhm.
back and forth playing our favorite, jazz numbers. And mine went back to the 20s. His was more contemporaneous, but it was so much fun doing that show and doing it with him. Um, Again, if somebody said you have to give up UFO stuff, but you can still do all of your other stuff, it would be wistful for me. Although at this point, I think the thing that is most important to me about being involved in the work is all of the wonderful people that I've come to be close to because of the work. And I'm not going to make believe that's not the case. I mean, I take a great deal of pride in my contributions to it, but
Mhm.
they have become secondary gradually over the years to the amazing friendships. Just a few weeks ago in Hull, England, being a keynote speaker at a conference there, um, it was so wonderful to reconnect with people I hadn't seen in years, make some new friends, friends who I've developed over the social network that I've really not been engaged with, except that we become real friends over the social network. And there we were together for the first time, but fully established friendships. And just to generally be back there. Um,
Peter, where can people listen to Meanwhile Here on Earth, your podcast?
It's actually an old fashioned radio show still. It goes out live on radio station KGRA on Mondays, 7 to 9 o'clock. It goes back and forth between in depth, often deeply biographical interview conversations with leading people in UFO and paranormal work, but also artists, writers, musicians, anybody really that I want to have on that show. You
Mhm.
can listen to it and watch it on Mondays, again, 7 to 9 at kgradb.com. That's kgradb for digital broadcasting.com.
Mhm.
You can listen to archived shows at Spreaker.com. And if you subscribe to KGRA, of course, there's a whole backlog of them. I'm trying to think how many I've done now. Certainly not 100, but probably in the 70s or so, and had several I guess, several hundred guests because I go back and forth between panel discussions, as you know,
Yeah, yeah.
and these in-depth conversations with people who fascinate me. And in great part, my prerogative there is, how did you become the person you are? And give them an opportunity to tell the stories of their lives. This past Monday, although it was pre-recorded because I was still out of the country, was Ralph Blumenthal. Ralph, who has become better known more recently for his spectacularly interesting biography of Dr. John Mack of Harvard, who was, of course, a leading alien abduction researcher, but who was
Mhm.
also a Pulitzer Prize winner, like Ralph was. Ralph was a staff writer for the New York Times for 50 years
Yeah.
and was everywhere, including Vietnam, Cambodia, Central Europe, covering the mob, covering neo-Nazis, uh, covering New York politics, covering the world to a degree, is a professor of journalism at CCNY, teaches at Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, famous for two very famous UFO incidents every summer, and a lifelong New Yorker. It was a breathtaking interview. I just think the world of him. And he got involved in the subject of UFOs years ago because of the cover up and because of his friendship with journalist Leslie Kean, who has had a great deal to do with legitimizing this subject in so many ways for the mass media. So
Right.
do join me on that show on Mondays, and I'll try to keep the good guests coming at you.
Yeah, please, everyone, check out Meanwhile Here on Earth live with Peter Robbins. Peter, thank you so much for being on.
It's my pleasure, Alan, and best to you and your amazing wife. And again,
Thank you.
congratulations on a very thoughtful documentary. Very well done. If you have not seen Half-Life, see it.
Yes, and thank you for participating in it. Peter, have a good night. And thank you, everyone, for hanging out with us tonight. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this live radio podcast, you can subscribe down below on Paranormal Pop on YouTube, youtube.com/paranormal pop. Please like, subscribe, comment down below, share. That will help this channel grow. Let's get it going. We crossed the 500 subscriber mark. Thank you. Now we have to get to the 1,000 subscriber mark. That's the next tier. So all of your help, anyone out there who can help share, encourage others to join this fantastic community we have growing here, I would really appreciate that. And a reminder that if you missed tonight's show or any show, you can get the rebroadcast on the UNX network at 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And of course, the podcast version will be available tomorrow. Thank you all once again. Peace and love, and live in the mystery.